Good morning. My name is Ted Poe. I am a member of Congress from the 2nd District in the state of Texas. I want to welcome here today two other individuals, and we have some other co-sponsors arriving shortly. Carolyn Maloney from New York is a co-sponsor of this legislation that we have. And we have Rick Nolan just came in. He's from Minnesota. He's also a co-sponsor. And Christy Nome from South Dakota is as well a sponsor of this bill. Two yes senators, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Cornyn are the lead sponsors in the United States Senate. Talking today about the legislation that we have filed, the End Sex Trafficking Act of 2013. What is occurring in the United States that a lot of people refuse to understand or believe is that young people, girls primarily, are moved about throughout the United States and trafficked into modern-day slavery. Some of those young girls are Americans, some are from America, and some are from foreign countries. They are brought in to the United States and trafficked throughout the country. Unfortunately, international sex trafficking, the hub is Houston, Texas, because of its location close to the border, my hometown. And they are trafficked by modern-day slave traders for sex. We have a Trafficking Victims Protection Act that prosecutes the trafficker, the guy that brings those girls throughout the United States. But the consumer, the buyer, is not prosecuted on the federal level because the bill doesn't include that individual. So what we have done with this legislation is to expand the current law, have an interstate nexus involved so as not to interfere with any state laws. But if there's an interstate connection and a young girl is transported across state lines, a buyer or finds a young lady on the internet, then the law applies to the buyer as well. The FBI recently did a nationwide operation, and they captured over 100 traffickers, those people who make money off of the sex slave trade. And they rescued over 100 victims. And I say victims because minors under the age of 17 are victims of crime if they are used in the sex trade. They are not prostitutes. But you notice in the states that most newspapers have listed all the cities where these cases took place. They didn't list who the buyer was, because the buyer is not prosecuted, because the law doesn't apply to them on the federal level if there's an interstate nexus involved. One case out of those over 100. There was a 13-year-old girl, 13-year-old child in Los Angeles was actually rescued by law enforcement in the act of sexual intercourse with a buyer in the 40s. But she was filed on for prostitution and taken to juvenile hall. The consumer, the buyer, got what amounted to a traffic ticket. The law enforcement knew the child was underage, even may have been forced into this. But the buyer gets away with the crime, and the buyer is the person that should be held accountable for the deviant act of being involved in forced sex, having a young child have sex with that buyer without her consent, especially when she's underage. This law then centers on the buyer and goes after the consumer and makes them accountable under the Victims Protection Act, Trafficking Protection Act. And it strengthens the current law so that they are subject to the same punishment as the trafficker who brought them across interstate lines. We have over 85, 87 now groups throughout the United States that are trying to protect children And they have signed onto this legislation in support of this legislation. I just want to say one other thing before I introduce Carolyn Maloney. Our culture in this country needs to understand that when young girls are forced into prostitution against their will, especially minors, they are not prostitutes. They are victims of crime, and we should regard them as victims of crime. Rescue them from that situation, and then go after the person that took them across state lines, and go after the buyer as well. And let buyers know that they cannot be assaulting children in this country and get away with it. And I would like Carolyn Maloney to give some comments. She's been working on this issue long before I was even in Congress, so she's the expert. This is a bipartisan bill. I'm going to say this about Carolyn Maloney. She's from New York. I'm from Texas. We have a language barrier that we have worked out. But this is a perfect example of bipartisanship on an issue that really results in safety for crime victims in the United States. So I'd like for her to make whatever comment she wishes.
I want to thank my colleagues in the House for working on this bill, sponsoring it, but particularly my good friend and colleague, Representative Ted Poe. He has brought a new energy and strength to this cause with his experience as a judge and a former prosecutor. For years I've been working on the demand side. He has brought a leadership that I believe will move this bill quickly through the House. Back in 1999, there was a big sex trafficking ring in the district I was privileged to represent. They would advertise, go to Thailand, any kind of Philippines, and we'll get you as many kids as you want. I tried to close them down. It was illegal in our country, I thought, illegal in Thailand, illegal in the Philippines. Every level of law enforcement told me they did not have the law to do this. Even Janet Reno said they could not crack down on Big Apple tours. So together in a bipartisan way, in 2000, we passed the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We have strengthened that bill and reauthorized it over the years. Recently, in the Violence Against Women Act, it was part of that bill and the reauthorization, and a bill that Congressman Poe and I worked on to help the victims, the young people, to provide services to them, to track and try to understand the extent of the problem was there. But this bill is aimed at reducing the demand for sex trafficking by giving law enforcement the tools and authorities what they need to prosecute the so-called buyers, the Johns, that solicit sex from children and other victims. I began working on this challenge with Deborah Price, a former Republican woman who was a judge, a former judge. And she told me as we worked on it that she would convict prostitutes over and over and over. She never once convicted a John. And she never stopped to ask them, how did this happen to you? We started asking and found out what a terrible crime it is. They believe that the missing children in our country, that many of them are stolen or trafficked, tricked children that are put into this 21st century form of slave trade. So this bill will go after the John, the consumer, the demand side, and curb the demand. And you can, if you curb the demand, you're going to get a dent in the trafficking. Paying for sex with children is harmful not only to the victims, but I would say to society at large. It is harmful not just now, but over time. And this bill makes it abundantly clear to any judge, in any court, in any jurisdiction, that it is the intent of this Congress to say that paying for sex with children and other trafficked victims is a crime. Wherever it happens, whenever it happens, and wherever it happens, and however it happens, in any case. We saw earlier this week the extent of a sting, the number of children involved, the number of traffickers involved. But what really brought the attention to this case was a federal appeals case ruling that was absolutely, I thought, astonishing and unfortunate and wrong. In the federal appeals court ruling that made this amendment completely necessary, Officers, undercover officers, pretended to be a man placing an online ad offering to provide his girlfriend's 11-year-old daughter for sex in return for money. A man responded to the ad, and after being told that the girl was just 11, and after being sent a picture, the man made and said he intended to pay money to have sex with an 11-year-old child. The predator crossed a state line to get to the house where the child was supposedly being offered, and again confirmed his intentions. Instead, he was arrested, charged, tried, and convicted under the federal anti-trafficking law. Unfortunately, a federal district court ruled that in writing the federal anti-trafficking law, Congress had never intended that the consumers, the buyers of sex trafficking, would ever be prosecuted under the law. So the conviction was overturned and the man was released. This was outrageous. Well, we are here today to say loudly and clearly that Congress does not want our anti-sex trafficking law to apply. We want it to apply to Johns, to buyers, to the demand side, to the consumers. It applies to people who pay to have sex with minors. And to make it crystal clear that we will add this language to the existing law so that there will never again be any question about what the intent of Congress is about this issue. Soliciting or obtaining sex with minors, paying to have sex with a child, is a crime, period, end of story. This is a monumentally important bill that will really, I think, do more to curb this terrible crime of slavery in the 21st century. I applaud Ted Poe for his leadership. I see my great friend from the United States Senate who is leading this charge in the Senate. I thank you so much for her leadership on the Joint Economic Committee on this issue. I can't tell you how happy I am. This is the biggest step forward, I believe, in combating this crime that I have seen since we passed TVPA in 2000. Thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you. Well said. Well said. We have our senator, lead sponsor, along with Senator Cornyn in the Senate. Senator Klobuchar will speak now. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Congressman Poe. Thank you to my colleagues from Minnesota, Congressman Nolan, and also Congresswoman Maloney and Congresswoman Noem, a great softball player. That was a lot of fun that day. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We welcome you to our Senate recording studio, humble that it is. Senator Cornyn and I were actually together at the Judiciary Committee, and he's got some bills up, so I stepped out, but he is leading this bill on the Republican side in the Senate. I'm leading on the Democratic side, and this really came for me out of my work as a prosecutor. So many times we would get these child porn cases and others that would come in with image after image of children that are victims of sexual assault, rape, horrible acts, and you literally would think, who are these children? And you knew they were real children. And every so often we would be able to track them down. And since that time, when I came here and left the prosecutor's office in 2006, it's only gotten worse. Every year, thousands of criminals prey on children and trafficking victims in the U.S., purchasing illicit and coerced sexual acts on websites like Backpage.com. And as we crack down on trafficking in urban areas, we've also seen a rise in rural areas. On Monday, just to give you an example, the FBI announced the arrest of 150 people and recovery of 105 children involving child prostitution rings in 76 cities across the country, including Minneapolis and St. Paul. Last week, police arrested 2 sex traffickers in my state, and that is just in 1 week. It is completely unacceptable, and that's why Senator Cornyn and I are honored to join with these House members in a true bipartisan effort. The police that work on these issues and make these arrests don't ask each other if they're Democrats or Republicans. Certainly, when we have victims come in, they don't ask those questions. And this is an example in the criminal area where we've tended to be able to work incredibly well across party lines to get things done. Senator Cornyn and I have another bill in this area that is also co-sponsored by several senators, Senator Portman, Blumenthal, Casey, Franken, and Rubio, that makes this a reportable crime under the federal crime statistics for Part 1 violent crimes. again, we have seen this before, whether it's domestic violence, whether it is wearing seatbelts. When you make a statement on the national level and say something's wrong, like passing the Violence Against Women Act or passing a seatbelt law, it actually sends a message to the states, and people start thinking about these crimes differently. We know most of these cases are handled on the state basis, but some of them are handled on the federal basis. And more than that, by standing here today, we send a clear message that sex trafficking is wrong, it's illegal, it's a major problem, and when the new senator from New Jersey stands up and gives his first speech on the Senate floor, because they're going to have the Super Bowl in their state, and it's a huge place for sports, but it's also a huge place for sex trafficking. His first speech was about sex trafficking, and I think it's just nothing you can just put under the door and pretend it doesn't exist anymore. It's right out there when you see the numbers. So thank you to my House colleagues for showing leadership in this area, and we look forward to passing this bill.
Thank you. Rick Nolan from Minnesota.
Thank you. I'd just like to commend Congressman Carol Maloney and Judge Congressman Poe and our distinguished senator from Minnesota and my colleague Christie, but particularly Carol and Ted and Amy for the leadership that you've shown in the effort to eliminate and put an end to this unspeakable, despicable crime that occurs in the trafficking of our children. And you've done a wonderful job of explaining what in fact the legislation does. It's an important step forward, and I'm just honored and thrilled to be a part of it, and I think we have here the ingredients to put an end to this terrible crime. So I couldn't be more proud and more pleased to be a part of this joint House, Senate, bipartisan effort to put an end to this terrible crime. Thank you. Kristen? Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here today, and I haven't been in Congress very long, but this is an issue that the more I learn about it, the more it keeps me up at night. I'm a mother of 3, and I have 2 teenage daughters, and some of the sad statistics that surround this issue really are alarming. When you look across the country, we have 4.5 million sex trafficking victims across the world. 98% of those are women and girls, young girls. It's not somebody else's problem either. When you look at what's going on in the United States, you definitely see that the demand is there, the market is there, and that's why someone is filling that demand. We have over 100,000 to 300,000 victims just within our borders, within the United States, that are victimized every single year through these sex trafficking rings and circles. And the demand must be stopped, which is why this bill has come forward, and why I appreciate Carolyn's leadership and Ted's leadership on something that is damaging our children and damaging our culture every single day. You know, for me particularly, we have Native American tribes in the state of South Dakota. It's been proven through the statistics and a lot of the research that has been done on sex trafficking that American Indian young women are certainly more potentially at risk and at higher risk to become victims in this manner. And it's something that we need to address. The court case and the prosecution of the 2 men who solicited sex trafficking victims happened in South Dakota. The sting operation was set up, those men were brought forward, they were prosecuted and convicted, but it wasn't able to be upheld because our laws simply weren't clear, and that's unacceptable. We need to make sure that not only those who are involved in the supply are prosecuted, but also those who demand it. Those consumers who come forward and are willing to have sex with an 11-year-old girl are put in jail forever, so that we don't have to deal with that type of a situation again. We have to do more. The FBI is working with local police, and like was mentioned earlier, we've had over 150 different pimps that were prosecuted, and 105 children that were saved in a 3-day period because we were actively going after this issue that we have. This bill makes it very clear. What this bill simply does is it says we're going to arrest, we're going to prosecute, and convict criminals from the top down, that we're going to make sure that those who supply, but also those who partake in that supply, are going to be treated equally under the law because of this clarity that we're bringing to the language today. For me, this is very close to my heart. I think that it is something that we have the unique opportunity to change people's lives forever by making that clarification in law and making sure that we bring these perpetrators and degenerates to justice. Thank you.
Well said. I appreciate everybody being here. Questions? Direct them to a specific person if you want to. If you have a question. Yes.
As was mentioned in passing, sex trafficking victims aren't only children, they're also adults in certain circumstances. So it seems like they're really the only way to end demand for sex trafficking victims as a whole would be to combat prostitution across the board. I mean, you could argue that there are customers who were not aware that their victims might be trafficked. So I was wondering what you thought about, whether would you need to ramp up efforts, on whatever level to combat prostitution as a whole.
Of course, there are state laws, but this law is specific. It deals with interstate consumers, like as Ms. Noel mentioned, using Backpage or some other entity. And primarily, this is dealing with children, and many of them, probably most of them in my opinion, are forced into this activity. So it's young women who are children, and the buyer gets off the hook because the law does not prosecute the buyer. So it's not really an issue of prostitution, this is an issue of child slavery that this bill attacks. And the idea that only the trafficker, the guy that moves them across state lines, can be prosecuted, those days are going to be over on the federal level if there's a federal connection. The idea that the comment that's made, well, boys will be boys, well, those days are over if it's involving children going across state lines who are forced into prostitution. So that's different than the issue of consensual sex between adults. This bill doesn't talk about that. Yes.
Christopher Deering with Connect. If either of you, Senator Klobuchar or Representative Poe, if you just speak to the passage of the bill, how you plan to go about doing it?
Given that Senator Cornyn and I are both on the Judiciary Committee, I feel good about getting this through the committee. I will predict we will do that right now. And then we have been able to get a number of bills. You know, we had a recent agreement on nominations, which just kind of bled over into some of the legislation. We've been able to pass a number of bills in the Senate, from the Farm Bill to the Immigration Bill, getting for the first time in 7 years an ATF director confirmed last night. And so I feel very good that we will be able to get a bill like this through the Senate, either hotlining it or attaching it to some other bill, and I would hope we would be able to simply get it through unanimously.
And then the House side, same.
I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and I think it will move in the Judiciary Committee, but it's like all legislation, we don't know. But, that's where it's going to be, and there is broad support on both sides in the Judiciary Committee.